I am Peter Popescu and welcome back to my course on Spring Boot. In this lesson, we'll be looking at Spring Security and how we can authorize users so that some endpoints are only accessible for logged in users, some are accessible by everyone, and some endpoints only by users that have certain roles. First, let's enable Spring Security in our build.gradle file and reload the project if you didn't already do this. Remember, we disabled Spring Security previously in the course so that we can simply test our application and I can easily show you how things get done without needing to log in or implement a security authenticator. Once you enabled Spring Security, let's first create a simple login form. I created another template, login.html, where I have a form with the method post and the URL /login.html. I have two input fields, one for username, one for password, and obviously a submit button. I also have a controller where I return this login page. Now, what I need to do is implement a security configuration. To do this, I created a new class. I named it security configuration. I added the @configuration annotation and @enable web security. This will indicate to Spring that this configuration file is for security, for web security, for Spring security. And I added a new bin called the security chain, which returns a security filter chain. If you remember in our previous lesson, I showed you that there are filters and request interceptors. Spring Security uses a series of filters in order to authorize users. Once a request comes into Spring, the security filter chain gets activated and it checks if everything is enabled. It checks if the user has the proper roles to access that endpoint, and if not, it returns an error. So what I did was added a new bin which instantiates a security filter chain. It accepts an HTTP security as an input parameter, and in this method we are going to build a simple security filter chain. First, I added the coarse filters. I just added the default ones, and in most applications it is enough. And after that, I added the authorize HTTP requests. This will indicate to Spring Security what requests need to be filtered and for what requests, what users can access it. And I added request matchers. This indicates that all endpoints that have this pattern, admin and whatever comes after it, this is star star means wildcard, are only accessible by users that have the role admin. Similarly, endpoints that start with user are only accessible by users that have the role user. Index.html and login.html are accessible by any user. And any other request, so any other request that is not from here, needs to be fully authenticated. Furthermore, I specified to the HTTP security chain what to do, what is the login handler. We use form login, and the login page is /login.html, and the default success URL, so where it is redirected after login is successful, is index.html, and it will always redirect to that. Furthermore, login.html is accessible by everybody. That's why I added permit all. I also added a logout handler. So the logout page is logout.html, and it is on a get method. By default, Spring Security requires a post to do the logout, but I changed that using the logout request matcher to have a logout.html method with a get. This way we can simply test it in the browser by entering the URL. And again, it is accessible by everybody. After that, I just return the security filter chain by calling http.build. Now, if we start our application, we can go to our page and you will see that we have our login form. And if we go to index.html, the index page is easily accessible. I created a test controller with multiple endpoints. One admin/test, user/test, a simple.test, and the index page. Let's see what happens if we access admin/test. You will see that we get redirected to the login form. This is because we didn't authenticate in our application. To do this, we also need to implement an authentication provider. I implemented a very simple one, a user login provider, which implements authentication provider. As you can see, this is a component. This means that we can inject other bins into it. And normally you will be injecting a service or a DAO so that you can retrieve user information from the database or from another resource. And I added two simple users, one with the username admin and one with the username user. Both have the same password. Again, this is only for simplicity and for learning purposes. Normally, what you would do is you would retrieve the username, get the user with that username from the database, and validate that the password is the one that is stored using the security algorithm, the hash algorithm that you used when storing the password. But for simplicity, I just hard-coded two users. Now, we need to override the authenticate method. This method receives an authentication input parameter, and this authentication has the get name, which is the username, and the credentials, which is the password. We are retrieving them from the authentication input parameter, and we are checking if the user is admin and the password is the one that we had here hard-coded, then it means we have an admin. Similar if we have the user. If none of these matches, we simply return null to indicate that the authentication failed. Once the authentication is successful, we need to tell to Spring this user what role does it have. To do this, we have a list of granted authorities. These authorities store the user role and what privileges that user has. I simply added a simple granted authority with the role admin for admin and the role user for user. And I returned a new username and password authentication token that has the username, password, and authority list. This method, if we look, can have any object as the principal and the credentials. This means that we can store whatever object we need, and on complex applications, we'll be storing more than the username. Maybe we need the user ID, the username, the full name, and whatever information we need to be able to have the user information without needing to go back to the database every time, as long as the information is secure. So we are not going to store the password in clear text. For simplicity, I just have the username and the password here along with the authority list. So once the username and password are provided in the login form, this component will be automatically injected by Spring because Spring does a sweep over our classes to see what authentication providers we have. And if it detects one, it will send that login request to here. If we place a breakpoint here and go back to our browser, if we enter admin123, we'll see that our request arrives here. We retrieve the username admin and the password, but none of them match, so we return null. Going back to our browser, you'll see that we are redirected back to the login.html page, but we have one extra parameter called error. This is very helpful if we want to show an error message, for example, username or password invalid. Now let's do a simple login. Let's enter a valid username and a valid password. I think I accidentally entered wrong again. No, it's okay. And as you can see, now we are building our authority list and returning username and password authentication token. And if we go back to our browser, we are getting redirected back to our index.html. Now we can just enter admin/test and you can see that we can access the admin page. However, if we enter user, we are receiving a forbidden and 403 error. We are getting a white label error page because we didn't implement any custom templates for our error pages. We can do this later on, and I'll be showing later in the course how you can implement a fancy looking error page. For now, we are using the default, which just returns the type and the HTTP status code. Similarly, in our test controller, we have another endpoint /test. If we enter it here, you'll see that test page is accessible because in our security configuration, we specify that any other request that is not admin, not user, not index, and not login needs to be fully authenticated, so it doesn't matter what role the user has. If we go to logout.html and now try to reach test, you will see that we are getting redirected back to the login form. It may be a little bit difficult to do these request matchers for every endpoint or for every combination of endpoints you want. That is why Spring Security has another way of doing things, which in some situations is harder, but it is a bit more error prone. Alongside enable web security, there is another annotation called enable method security. And if we use this one, we can specify directly in the controller what roles the user must have in order to access that endpoint. I created another controller called method security controller, and here I have another endpoint, get mapping my URL. And using the pre-authorize annotation, I specify that this endpoint is only accessible for users that have the role admin. Keep in mind that here we need to specify with the role and underscore prepended exactly as we did in our login provider when we added the granted authority. The role by convention starts with role and underscore. So if we add pre-authorize, this will indicate to Spring Security that only authorized users that have what we enter here, so has role role admin can access this endpoint. If we restart our application, go back to our browser and enter my URL, you'll see that we get redirected. If we log in with user, let's remove this breakpoint. We are now logged in and enter my URL. You will see that we don't have the rights to access it. Let's log out. And now let's log in with our administrator user. And now going to my URL, you will see that we can access this page. This means that what we added here is correct. Again, because we are using simple strings to describe this authorization protocol, it is a bit more error prone than having it in the security configuration. However, it is in certain situations easier to do this. Furthermore, we can just move this to directly to the controller class, and this means that all methods and all URLs that are in the same controller will have the same pre-authorize rule. There are again a few other descriptors. There is has role, has any role if you want to add multiple roles, and has authority, which work mostly in the same way. So this is a very short introduction into Spring Security. Hopefully, I managed to show you how to enable Spring Security and how to define your security endpoints for login and logout, as well as how to define what users have access to what endpoints. In our next lesson, we'll be looking at how to integrate Spring Security directly into Thymeleaf, because Thymeleaf has a few utility methods that make it very easy to specify directly in the template engine if certain things are visible only to certain users. But that in a later course. Hope this is very useful, and I hope I'll see you again in my next lesson.